All right, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to our last Green Living seminar presentation of this semester. These presentations have all revolved around the theme Rewilding Our World, and they have all taken place here at MCLA in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation. They are all free and open to the public. I'm Dr. Elena Traister in the Environmental Studies Department here at MCLA. And if you want to see the list of speakers we had and links to recordings of their presentations on YouTube, you can take a look at our site. It's www.mcla.edu/greenliving. Our presentation again today will go for about 45 minutes, and there will be a Q&A session at the end, so keep all those great questions coming at the end. There'll be time for those. And I'd like to then turn it over to our speaker tonight, Dr. Oswald Schmitz, Oastler Professor of Population and Community Ecology at the Yale School of the Environment, is presenting on animating the carbon cycle, how conserving and restoring wildlife can help mitigate climate change.
Very much for inviting me, Elena, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm a professor of ecology. I was hired at Yale to be a wildlife ecologist, and so I've spent my 30-year career there doing work with small wildlife and large wildlife species. This is what I'm going to talk to you today about is work that was inspired by research in old fields, much like the ones you see around here, and looking at species interactions, but then trying to scale it up and think about how we can improve the environment and live with nature together, especially with wildlife, and both conserving and restoring wildlife. So the idea of rewilding, or in the case I'm going to talk about trophic rewilding, which is rebuilding the food web structure of ecological systems that include animals as part of it. That idea isn't sort of popular as much in the United States as it is in Europe and Africa and Asia. So the whole notion of rewilding is an idea that's come about in places where people are trying to restore nature and bring back nature and have people live with nature. In the North American scene, there's still a lot of wilderness spaces, and so the North American sort of perspective on this hasn't really adopted the rewilding idea as much as we might. Hopefully I can convince you that it might be worthwhile to sort of rethink nature conservation for the benefit of us, and it's through climate mitigation. So what is the fundamental problem that I'm trying to address? So we all know that we have a huge amount of atmospheric CO2 that has built up since the start of the Industrial Revolution about 250 years ago, right? So as we industrialized our economy, we started digging up resources to fuel that economy, and burning those fossil fuels led to emissions to the atmosphere. And they rose, in an accelerated way as we accelerated our economic and industrial growth. Now, the IPCC, the International or Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, right, is really trying to get us to arrest climate change, to mitigate climate change, so that we don't actually have serious consequences for the planet and life on this planet. The most important sort of IPCC meeting or COP meeting was the Paris meeting, where everybody agreed that we would try and reach net zero emissions by 2050. The reality is we're not going to, but still it was an ambitious target, right? So what the idea is that what we do is stop or reduce our fossil fuel burning and emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere, so that by 2050 we're actually not emitting anything on the net. Okay, we're not emitting to the atmosphere, and therefore we're going to control climate change. The problem is, even if we reach net zero, we still have about 500 gigatons. So 500 gigatons or 500 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's still a legacy of doing this, all right? And so even if we stopped and reached net zero by 2050, we would still blow through 2 degrees C on the planet in terms of warming. we have to actually remove this also, not just net zero, we have to do more than net zero. Because, as I say, if we don't, we're going to blow through 2 degrees Celsius, planetary warming. So another push that's going on now, and it's starting to rise, is thinking about negative emissions, right? So what we want to do is take all of that carbon that's in the atmosphere and draw it down and store it on the planet. And that's what we mean by negative emissions. We want to enhance the sink strength of the planet. So what we need to do is sort of figure out ways where we can capture that CO2 and store it on the planet. And if we can do that, by the turn of the century, we have a good hope of stopping climate change from going above 2 degrees Celsius, right? So it's through enhancing the Earth's CO2 sink strength. And one way to do that that's really being proposed is really, let's use a technology that's been around for billions of years, and that's nature. Let's let nature do its job or help it along. And that's what we call nature-based or natural climate solutions. And if we're going to use natural climate solutions, what we have to do, if we're just thinking over the period between now and 2100, so the next 75 years to 100 years, so that's the time horizon we're thinking about this, we need to suck out about 6 to 7 billion tons of CO2 each year out of the atmosphere and store it on the planet. Okay, if we can do that over this time period, we actually have a good shot of getting rid of that 500 gigatons. But we do have to stop emitting, right? Because this amount is what the US emits every year. Okay? So if we try and suck this out, we're still pumping it into the atmosphere, we're getting nowhere. So this does not supplant the need to reduce our emissions and get to net zero also. This is on top of that. Now, people have proposed that nature can help us in 2 ways. The first is by avoiding emissions, that is protecting what we have that's natural, right? And so we protect forests, we protect wetlands, we protect grasslands, we protect the various ecosystems. And why is that good? Because those ecosystems, the plants, through photosynthesis, are taking up the CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it on the planet already, right? So one of the reasons why we have, a bit of a balance of CO2 budgets on this planet is because what we do emit, 50% of that gets sucked up by the Earth already in terms of photosynthesis in plants. So let's protect that. If we do that, we avoid 5 gigatons of emissions, or 5 billion tons of emissions, right? So if we start destroying other ecosystems that aren't destroyed on this planet, then we actually exacerbate the problem and we don't reach net zero at all. But in terms of enhancing the sinks, we can improve nature, right? Restore nature or rewild nature and bring natural processes back. And part of that is through managing timberlands better, so we don't have wildfires. Managing croplands. So these nature-based solutions also think of people as part of nature, and that agriculture can be thought of as a different instantiation of nature, and it can help us, right? So if we do climate-smart agriculture, we change how we graze the lands, you can also help and create potentially agricultural activities that can also help store carbon on this planet. And then there's also restoring forests and restoring wetlands. And if you can do that, you get another 5 gigatons, right? So you increase the sink strength by 5 gigatons a year. But that still means, remember I said we need 6 to 7. So there's a 1 to 2 gigaton per year shortfall, right? So we're not quite there yet with how people have calculated what the planet can do. But what about animals, right? If you look, the only animal here is a cow, right? They don't think of wild animals really as part of the story. So what about wild animals? Well, in classic Ecology 101, you learn that if you were to look at the mass or the biomass of vegetation, the biomass of herbivores, and the biomass of predators, what you would find is it sort of if you added it all together, you would get a trophic pyramid is what it's called, right? So what this means is that these guys are orders of magnitude fewer than these guys. These guys are order of magnitude fewer than these, right? So animals are rare in ecosystems relative to the vegetation in terms of biomass representation in those ecosystems, right? And so people have assumed because they're rare, they're not going to contribute much. You can't store much carbon in this to make a difference, right? That's been the argument. So let's focus on the vegetation, which can have the biggest impact. And also the soils. I haven't put soils on here. Soils are a vast storage repository for carbon. But the problem is that's not the complete holistic way of looking at what animals do. Animals also have feedback effects on these bigger biomass pools. And they can do it in various ways, which I'll get into in a minute. And so they have an impact that's disproportionately larger than their biomass representation would suggest. Okay? And so a lot of ecological science that deals with the climate problem doesn't understand and appreciate the role of these animals. And that's why I've really pushed this agenda of really, let's thinking about animals as part of the equation. So again, the classic thinking is that you have certain animal biomass, but they don't respire enough CO2 to the atmosphere to make a difference. And even the methane issue is not a big issue, okay, unless you're overstocking cattle. But it's the plant and the soil pool that's releasing most of the CO2 to the atmosphere. But the feedback effect is really what happens here, the release of nutrients in animal waste and plant waste, especially in dung. Dung is rich in carbon. If it goes into soil storage, you might be able to store it, right? But also, recycling of nutrients actually boosts the productivity of plants, right? It fertilizes plants, and so they can nourish things and really boost the ability of plants to thrive and flourish, okay? So I'm going to walk through a few examples, though. But in general, there are, it doesn't matter if you're looking at the high Arctic or the deep ocean, there are only a few key ways that animals can impact the carbon cycle, okay? That's through their foraging, right? They remove vegetation, and they can recycle it, but they remove vegetation. If you remove some vegetation, certainly you're not going to be able to take up as much carbon, right? But they also deposit nutrients. And those nutrients nourish and fertilize the vegetation. So when you're thinking about foraging and animal impacts, you often hear that, oh, these herbivores are destroying the vegetation because they're eating it. But you have to look at the other end of the story, literally, right? And see what's being fed back into the system to be able to come up with a balanced perspective, right? And they also disturb, like they can compact the soil. And what that does is it sometimes prevents the soil from, soil microbes from being highly active. They can deposit organic matter, right, in their dung, in their body carcasses, and they can disperse seeds. And those seeds, germinate and regenerate forests, and that can also be important. So let me walk you through a couple of examples of how this all works. So let's go to the high Arctic, right? One of the things you might have heard right now is a bit of a crisis situation in the high Arctic, that the Arctic is being filled up with shrubs, right? Shrubs are really flourishing in the high Arctic, and part of the reason is that there aren't enough herbivores in the high Arctic to eat those shrubs back. And this becomes problematic because the shrubs actually grow fairly tall. They can be about this high. And then when the snow falls, the snow falls in between the shrubs, and you've got a pretty thick snowpack. And then, basically in the high Arctic, you also have permafrost that stores carbon, and it's organic carbon. If you've ever seen any pictures, it can be, 500 feet to 700 feet thick, and it's just full of organic matter that's built up since the Pleistocene. Tens of thousands to 100,000 years ago, right? It's built up. That's all huge organic matter sitting there in a frozen animated state. The problem with the shrubs is that as spring comes, they absorb solar radiation, right? And they absorb a lot of solar radiation, warm up the soil surface. And that, in addition to a really thick snowpack, the snowpack actually insulates. Think of it as a puffy down coat, right? So this is the puffy down coat situation. So this keeps the soil warmer from the summer because you have a pretty thick snowpack. And then you also have shrubs that absorb the solar radiation. What it does is causes permafrost thawing. What the animals do is they eat the shrubs back so that you get down to more grass and mosses and forbs. And they trample the snow, make the snowpack thin, and this way the cold air can penetrate the soil and keep it cold, right? You don't have that thick down jacket in this situation right here. And so what happens is these animals are trampling everywhere where they're walking. So they're having a disproportionate effect on that ecosystem just by walking around. And by grazing back the shrubs, they actually create a white surface in springtime still because the snow doesn't melt as quickly and the solar radiation bounces off. We call that an albedo effect. So they're changing the physical properties of ecosystems and protecting the permafrost from thawing. So if the permafrost thaws because these guys aren't present, we don't just release CO2 to the atmosphere because this becomes wet, right? It's frozen, it's ice. When it warms, it becomes wet. And the bacteria in that soil, when they break down the organic matter, in an anaerobic state, they release methane. Methane is 70 times more potent than CO2 in terms of its heat trapping capacity. So if the high Arctic warms, we're in trouble because we'll end up pumping another 500 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. We will have a very warm planet. Okay. Go back to the American West. We have bison, right? So bison, again, they forage, and you would think, oh, they just graze things down. But actually, the plants that they live with evolved to be grazed, right? They need to be grazed, and they need to be grazed with a wide mouth lawnmower, not necessarily a narrow mouth cattle. They need the wide mouth to graze everything. And when they do that, they actually become more productive. And the other thing is these animals, as they migrate in their herds, they urinate on the soil, and that urine is inorganic nitrogen, nutrients. And what that means is it's readily taken up in the same way as when you spread fertilizer on your lawn. It's an inorganic form. It doesn't require microbial breakdown, so it can quickly be taken up. And so you can get very fast cycling of nutrients in the soil, boosting that production, sucking up more carbon, and then when it dies, it ends up in the soil. If you don't have these herbivores, everything is a lot slower. Everything needs to be going through the microbial decomposition to release the nutrients. The system isn't as productive. You don't suck up as much CO2. Boreal forests, okay? You have wolves feeding on moose. By controlling the abundances of moose, you've got this really verdant forest of a mixed vegetation, right? And it's a cool soil surface because it's very shaded. And so you get very slow decomposition of any of the organic matter that ends up in here, from needles falling off the trees, leaves falling off the trees, animals dying. If you lose the wolves, then the moose increase in abundance. They eat back the forest, create bigger forest gaps. Solar radiation comes in, hits the ground, warms the soil up. Microbes start spinning up their activities, breaking down the organic matter, releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. So here's an example where wolves can actually protect the climate. Okay. In tropical environments, you've got anything from birds all the way to the biggest mammals in this system. This is just a toucan, an elephant, and a tapir. What these animals do, because they're large, they eat seeds or fruit from large seeded producing trees, right? And these are the big canopy trees. And those big canopy trees tend to be very, very carbon dense, right? They store on a per unit biomass basis much more carbon than the understory trees. And so by dispersing those canopy tree seeds in the, as they've eaten the fruit, they deposited the seeds in their dung. These sit on the soil surface, and because they're in this nutrient pool, they germinate more readily than if they don't pass through the digestive system. Again, the urine and everything recycles nutrients. So you get, you increase the germination and sustain the production of these tall trees. If you lose these animals, and these animals have been overhunted in various places in the Old World and the New World tropics, you don't get the regeneration of these heavy, dense carbon tree seeds. And so you end up with a very different forest canopy, much more gappy, and you don't store as much carbon per unit area. The ocean is a really big place where lots is happening, right? So you might have heard the classic case of sea otters eating sea urchins, which then releases kelp forests, and the kelp forests suck it up, right? That's the same idea as wolves feeding on moose, feeding on trees. It's called a trophic cascade. That is what rewilding actually tries to do originally, is bring back predators to reestablish that top-down control by predators. But sharks do the same thing in controlling the herbivores, manatees, herbivorous fish, sea turtles and whatnot. The classic example that you might have heard a lot about recently is whales. So the ocean actually is a very poor place to actually capture carbon on a per unit area basis. And the reason is it's very limiting in nitrogen and iron. And so the reason the ocean is so good is it's got this vast space. So the space scales it up, and that's why you get a vast amount. But on a per unit area basis, it's pretty low unless you have a subsidy. And the subsidy comes from whales diving deep into the ocean, eating prey that are full, rich in nitrogen and iron. And then as they go to the surface, they actually, as they're breathing, they defecate into the water and release nitrogen and iron in dissolved plumes of feces. And that nourishes the phytoplankton in the light zone, right? So this zone here, this is called the phototic zone or the light zone. That is really where all of the carbon gets stored up in plants in the ocean. And so as these animals move up here, they nourish that and can cause production. If you lose the the whales, then obviously you don't get as much phytoplankton production. Okay. Carbonate, fish. So a lot of fish, through their metabolism, saltwater metabolism, bind the salt with calcium. And so you get a carbonate, and that carbonate is like a hard ball, and they defecate it out, and it just sinks to the ocean floor. And so that's a really important way of storing a lot of carbon in the ocean. And then, again, through the trophic relationships and everything, you get a lot of waste release sinking to the deep ocean. You get body carcasses sinking to the deep ocean. And the deep ocean, the deep dark ocean, is a place where a lot of things get protected and stay stored for a long, long time because you're not disturbing it. Unless you do deep sea mining and things like that, right? Where that's becoming an issue. So deep sea mining could actually remove the benefits of this. So we have to think about how do we balance those trade-offs. Now, if we just calculate what the contributions is to the budgets of these regions. So what these data are here are studies where scientists have actually measured what the ecosystem is doing when the animals are absent. In some cases, they're experimenting it, so they're excluding the animals with exclosures. In some cases, they're able to compare parts of the ocean where the animals are versus where they aren't, right? And so what you can do is you measure how much contribution these animals are having to the carbon cycle by measuring what's happening where they're not present versus what's happening where they're present, and then you calculate the difference. And so these numbers here are the difference between animal absence and animal presence, okay? And you can see they're regional, and if you add those all up, what you end up finding is that you get 6.58 gigatons just from these 9 groups of animals. And we're talking all of the marine fish here, right? So you're getting 6.58 gigatons. Remember I said we need 1 to 2 additional, right? So right away, it's making a huge contribution to nature-based climate solutions. And let's drill into this a little more. Let's just look at the species. So wildebeest, they contribute a modest amount. Wolves across the Canadian boreal forest contribute a reasonable amount. Sea otters, again, a modest amount. Muskox in the high Arctic, a modest amount. Marine fish, by and large, are really, really important. And it's not the marine fish that are being fished, which are in the inshore. These are the deep ocean fish that aren't being fished yet. That's where the bulk of the fish biomass is on this planet. That's where the bulk of the action is. And right now, they're not protected from fishing, although they're not fished yet, but because we've overfished the shore, fishing industry is looking to fish into this zone, right? And if they do that, if they disrupt this, it wipes out all of this that's already going on, right? So, you know, part of the problem with the fishing story is that fishermen can put an economic value on fish. You know, I get this many landings, I can sell these in a market. We haven't really established good carbon markets yet, and we haven't valued fish for their carbon benefits, which could maybe be more than the return from fisheries, right? So we need to do a lot more from a policy perspective of figuring out how do we adequately come up with an economic value for this. But that is for another day. And by the way, this is already what's happening on the planet, and nobody is accounting for that yet in policy, right? They've accounted for it here, but they might account for it implicitly, but they don't explicitly account for these animals, okay? And so maybe the prognosis is not as pessimistic as we think, just because we haven't added up the numbers properly yet. The other thing is we have enhanced sinks, the potential. So here's where the rewilding story comes in. If we bring back forest elephants in the Congo, we can get a certain modest amount. Rewilding bison across the American West, not everywhere, in just 25% of the historical range, and that 25% are areas where there's minimal conflict between humans and wildlife, okay? This is not right in the middle of ranching land. These are in spaces where there isn't a high density of people and there is not the ranching issues. You can actually get a pretty substantial amount of carbon stored in the American West. Beaver, that should be 0.174 across North America and Eurasia. And then bringing back whales, right? So you can add almost another gigaton just by rebuilding populations of these animals and letting them move across the landscapes and fulfill their functional roles. The beauty of this also is that animals have regional effects. They don't have these global effects, right? When you get these IPCC reports or the Paris Climate Agreement, they have these 40,000 foot recommendations, right? So you and I, as an average citizen, we're standing there, okay, we need to do this, but what can I do? What can I, one of billions of people, do to help out, right? They don't really offer any local solutions. But the beauty of animals is they live in our backyards, right? You can imagine all sorts of animal species that live just around here. And if we do a better job of conserving and trying to, account for what they do in the ecosystems rather than just look at them as these animals that live in habitats, then maybe actually we can steward our local environments to make a contribution, right? So that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about trophic rewilding of animals. They can make a huge difference. And let's just put things into perspective here, okay? Again, I'm not saying we should use animals to offset emissions, but I'm scaling what they can do to the current emissions that are happening so you can see that they are meaningful. So wildebeest in the Serengeti. Through their migrations, through their grazing, they prevent wildfires. They cause the ecosystem to store carbon. And that amount is 28% of the fossil fuel emissions of Tanzania alone in 2021. Just this 12,000 square kilometer area the Serengeti, right? That's a significant amount. So protecting those migrations can really be beneficial to East Africa. Sharks and coral reefs, you know, just where they live, you know, that number disappeared. It can be the same amount of emissions that Kuwait emits. Okay? Sea otters, right, in the Aleutians, in Northern California all the way up to Alaska, 8% of the total greenhouse gas emissions of British Columbia, Canada. Gray wolves in the boreal, if we protect boreal gray wolves, 40% of Canada's fossil fuel emissions get stored in the boreal by controlling moose, okay? Or can get stored. Problem is, you've heard maybe that wolves are being culled in Canada to protect another endangered species, right? But they're not really accounting for the cost of doing that by, you know, changing the carbon dynamics. So they're not being accounted for in the bigger ecosystem context. Muskox in the circumpolar Arctic, that, you know, avoiding that shrubification and the release of methane and all that, equivalent to 75% of the fossil fuel emissions in Norway. Marine fish, and this is the marine fish in the mesopelagic. This is, you know, the ones that aren't being fished right now, twice the total fossil fuel emissions of EU and 3 times Africa, 1 time or equivalent to what the United States is emitting. Okay, and this is, if we protect these species, this is what we can get. Okay, so this is the avoided emission side of the story. If we think about restoring species also, like restoring African elephants in the Congo Basin, these are the forest elephants, which is a different species than the savanna elephants. The forest elephants, huge amount relative to the countries that they live in, right? And likewise with the bison, right? So American bison, 1.08, like a little more, 8% more than what Canada is emitting, okay? And 12% of what the US is emitting. In fact, these rewilded in the American West, where I said the 25% of the area, it can offset the equivalent of what the plains states are emitting collectively. So these are really important regional effects. But these animal effects are hidden in plain sight because we're not measuring them. We're not accounting for them in our global policies, right? So one of the things that we've done as researchers, we've also, you know, and the people aren't doing the science because they're not thinking, well, we should measure these things. So to motivate that, what we've done is developed a model, a mathematical model to quantify all of the exchanges. And so what we've done is basically taken a classic carbon cycle model that people use to, you know, craft policy for climate change mitigation using nature. But notice that one only focuses on plants and the soils, right? Thinking about photosynthesis, thinking about plants respiration, thinking about soil respiration, but they also focus on carbon and nutrient cycling. What we've done is just added the herbivores and accounting for more than just the herbivores eating the vegetation, but also causing recycling, respiration, both nutrient and carbon recycling, and we do that for the predators too, okay? And then you can go to the literature and get parameter values, because people have done wildlife ecology and know what they feed. You can go to the zoo data and figure out how much they recycle through defecation and urination. And so you can come up with first approximations of what these animals might do. And we've done this for several projects. So this is a European bison now, rewilded in the Tarcu Mountains region of Romania. And basically, this is what the ecosystem would store in the absence of these bison. This is what they would store in the presence of bison, 1.6 times more carbon with these animals present. That's what the modeling suggests. We still have to validate it, but what this does is sort of gets people to pay attention that maybe these animals are really important. We've also done work with a rewilding study that's happening in southern Chile and Patagonia National Park, where they rewilded pumas or mountain lions, and these are guanacos. It's a South American camelid that's also a grazer. You do that. This is La Patagonia Park. This is, by the way, a park that Christine Tompkins, who is the owner or former owner of Patagonia, actually bought this land for millions of dollars, rewilded it, and then gave it back to Chile as a public good. You know, basically Chile owns the park now that she bought the land from. If you restore these animals to their natural densities, you get twice the carbon stored in that system with the puma and the guanaco present. The guanaco stimulate the production, but they tend to grow in high abundances, so they could actually have bad impacts on the carbon cycle. So you need the pumas present also to control the abundances, so that the stimulating effect, you know, finds its sweet spot in that system. We've also done work looking at pumas and jaguars feeding on white-tailed deer and collared peccary in Mexican dry tropical forests, where they're feeding on shrubs, and then releasing, you know, competition with these canopy species. You get 3 times the carbon stored when you restore these. That's what's estimated. Okay, and it can be substantial because this is the extent of dry tropical forest in Mexico. Turns out this amount is the equivalent to about 10 to 15% of Mexico's fossil fuel emissions. Okay. And then elephants in the Congo, we've done some calculations also. And again, 1.77 times throughout the Congo Basin. So again, these numbers match up with sort of the calculations that I presented earlier on too. So, you know, these animals are having pretty substantial effects. Now, here are the policy implications. Part of the Paris Climate Agreement requires countries to do their nationally determined contributions, right? So the agreement was that every country will do its best to reduce their emissions and reduce their impact on the climate. But in order to do that, you have to actually calculate the sources of all the CO2, right? You have to do a very detailed accounting. And that requires sort of thinking about the various sectors that release CO2 to the atmosphere, and then think about what management you could do to sort of reduce the emissions, right? And it's agriculture, natural gas, commercial activities, electric generation, industrial resolution, et cetera, et cetera. But none of this actually requires an accounting of nature, right? What do nature-based solutions do, right? So these are emissions, but these are uptakes, right? And they're not being accounted for right now. We're not actually looking to nature as part of the story, and some countries may be able to do a lot better than other countries because of the nature value that they have in their countries. And then on top of that, animals are by far not even considered. Okay, if they think about nature, they think about trees mostly. And so we can do a lot more. What we need to do is get policymakers to pay attention to all of this also, and actually change how we specify our calculations of nationally determined contributions. They might not be as dire as what's being sort of measured, because if you don't count for this, it looks pretty bad, right? Closer to home, okay? I've spent 30-year career working in old fields, working with spiders and grasshoppers, so everything that I've been talking about right now was actually inspired by validating these principles that I've been talking about with measurements in old fields with spiders, interacting with grasshoppers, interacting with vegetation. I'm not going to get into that long research. I only have a couple more minutes here to talk before we're entertaining questions. But the point I want to make is that if you do go into an old field and sort of experiment and calculate what happens in the ecosystem in the absence of these guys and in their presence, and again, wolf feeding on moose, feeding on grassland analogy, and you do this exercise by sampling throughout various fields in Connecticut just to see, what variations you see. What you end up finding is that if you do the calculations from what's happening in the field to the broader Connecticut area, what you find is that on average you get about 2 times more carbon stored in an old field meadow in the presence of these guys than in their absence, right? Now, let's think about this in a cross. So just a rough back of the envelope calculation here. This is the extent in terms of acres, 63,000 acres of old field or abandoned agriculture fields in Connecticut. And this is done by GIS analysis looking at land cover. It's a very detailed, very accurate map. It's hosted by the University of Connecticut at the Clear Center. And so they've actually looked at different land covers, but let's just focus on this grass where these critters live and where I've sort of sampled. If you look at the sectors now, that again, this is Connecticut's determined contributions, right? Connecticut also calculates what its emissions are doing. So here are the sort of emissions. But if you look at what the old fields are absorbing in terms of carbon, it's 6% of what's being released by the ag sector, okay? 6% of natural gas leakage. Now you might think that's not a lot, but it's just old fields with bugs, and it's pretty substantial, right? And then you think about waste, it's 0.8%, right? Obviously it's going to be minuscule compared to these other bigger, heavier emitting sectors. But again, we have these things in our backyard, they're not accounting for it. And this is protecting and conserving wild spaces like this, these old fields, this legacy of our agriculture on the landscape, can actually be beneficial to actually help us locally fight climate change. Plus you're protecting biodiversity, you're restoring nature. It's a way that local communities can actually have an impact. And if you add this up across New England or across all of Eastern North America where you have old fields, it adds up, and it could be actually a meaningful impact in terms of our ability to arrest climate change. So the ambition that I have going forward is really trying to figure out, what all these other animal species and try and find hotspots of where we can actually invest in wilderness areas to rewild nature to do this. And that's a major research agenda that I have right now. And trying to inspire the scientific community to actually make the measurements, but also do the modeling to actually show them why it is important to do that. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to entertain questions. Yes.
Hi, I have a small rotational grazing operation for regenerative purposes, and while my love for rewilding will always outweigh my love for farming,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, do you think those two can coexist, or that more farmland needs to be turned into habitat that could give you wildlife?
No, I mean, the big issue with agriculture is the stocking densities of cattle, right? If you have to supplementally feed your cattle with hay, you're stocking too high, right? If you can graze your cattle to actually live in a sustainable way throughout the year on your range, then you can actually do regenerative agriculture. That's the big issue, with ag versus wildlife. So even bison at their highest densities when they were grazing are far fewer per unit square mile than how we're stocking cattle right now. So if people stock beef cattle at the densities that bison were, they wouldn't make money, right? They just don't have enough cattle to actually make ends meet. That's the big issue right now. Yeah. So that's another reason why we need to think about valuing carbon, put an economic price on carbon, because it may turn out these ranchers might make more by grazing buffalo and or bison and getting the carbon stored in the soil and getting paid for that. You might make way more than what you would get from beef cattle, right? So you could get both together on the landscape. Yeah. Other questions? Yep.
I have a question about just sort of I don't think I quite understand the numbers. For instance, I think you said the boreal forest is responsible for like 5.5 gigatons per year or something, or whatever that number is. Like, what about like an equilibrium? Like, it can't just keep doing that forever.
Well, there are two. Yeah. No. Excellent point. Okay. So the point of negative emissions is to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And once it gets sucked out and stored on the planet, then yes, it reaches a new equilibrium, right? And so you're not going to suck out additional stuff. It reaches at it because there isn't enough to suck out anymore, right? So you're reaching a new equilibrium. And so the sucking out stops because emissions are balanced by uptake again. The thing is, people assume that soil only stays this thick, but soil can grow in 3 dimensions, right? And that's where most of the carbon's stored on this planet. And again, if you take the lesson from the Pleistocene, and you have this, 700-foot thick piece of soil in permafrost, that grew over 100,000 years, right? And so I would argue you can grow the soil. There isn't going to be an equilibrium. You can continue to grow the soil, but to grow the soil requires having high emissions here that get stored, right? So once you reach an equilibrium, you're not going to grow the soil thickness anymore. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious, the direction that you're going in terms of like, potentially identifying hotspots or areas that would be good candidates for increasing animals for carbon storage and doing the modeling. And then there's sort of the step of there some sort of field testing. And there's, I think, more complexities also that you sort of didn't include in our 45 minutes of like things that could go wrong, right? That you don't predict. I'm curious if there are particular scenarios that you worry about that you couldn't predict just with the model?
The modeling will show situations where the animals aren't going to be beneficial too, right? We've sort of cherry-picked the literature to look at what's happening with the rewilding effort that are going on, and can they actually argue for the feasibility of using these animals for this, okay? But there are going to be cases where the modeling says no, animals aren't. The other thing is what the modeling shows is that these balances are kind of sensitive in some cases, especially with the predators present, right? And so just 10% or 15% change in a parameter magnitude can flip that into a carbon source, okay? So, I don't like to think of nature as a delicate balance. I'm not a fan of that sort of idea, but the modeling does show that you do have tipping points where it can be quite sensitive. It depends on the ecosystem type, but yeah. So in other words, when we're managing nature and getting things together and rebuilding nature, we should step back and let nature take over. That's another important sort of approach that rewilding takes. We don't heavily manage nature once it's rewilded. We step back. And that's probably the best way to achieve this balance that we need, rather than us fully managing it. Yes?
Who are the policymakers that you would need to convince that this is important?
I have presented at both the climate COP and at the biodiversity COP in Cali, Colombia last fall. Those are the people that we're reaching out to. I work with an organization called the Global Rewilding Alliance that has country partners all over. Part of the modeling that we're doing was actually funded by them to help their partners actually make the argument. So the word is spreading. It's grassroots. And because these folks are actually doing the rewilding, they don't need policy approval because it's approved. We just layer on top of that measurements of what these animals are doing for the carbon cycle, okay? But in terms of making general policy, I think the way we're doing it, this is especially with the International Fund for Animal Welfare, is they're lobbying policymakers to actually build nature into their nationally determined contributions. Once we start accounting for things, then we have to measure them. Once we measure them, we go, holy mackerel, right? And so it isn't even just making policy prescriptions. It's actually, let's do our due diligence and really account truly for what is happening in our backyards. Yeah.
There are people out there that are thinking.
Oh yeah, they're doing that. But it's just not discussed at the very high policy level. And so again, to me, what this says is that it's the regional folks that can have a bigger impact because they say, you know, screw the high level stuff, let's just do something here, right? And the other thing is, this can't happen in protected areas. We don't have enough protected area spaces across this planet to do this. We need to do this in working lands. And if we're going to do this in working lands, we actually have to work with local people and, you know, have conversations with people to see what their landscapes they want, is, you know, how they want to see their landscapes. It really comes down to a justice and equity issue too, in the sense that you can't just come in and say, we're going to just transform this landscape into something rewilded and you're going to lose your livelihood, right? So we have to actually talk to local people and get their buy-in. And that's the hard work, right? But if we can get people to work together, actually we might actually have a lot of gains that the policymakers here can't really deal with at the 40,000 foot level. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on that, it does seem like you need high-level policy changes in terms of being able to reward rewilding activities that have calculated carbon improvements.
Agreed.
As you were saying, convince the rancher that she can make more money
Right. Right.
running bison than
Right.
overgrazing.
Oh, that's a fair point. But the policy there comes into creating the market, like incentivizing the market that would pay for that, right? And it's not a really crazy idea because there are also already approaches called payments for ecosystem services that, you know, it's just another ecosystem service and you're paying for it, right? Because right now, if you are a rancher and you have carbon or you have bison, you're rearing bison, you're herding them, you're doing it, and they're contributing to sucking up the carbon. We free ride on that right now. We're not paying them to do that. And so we get the benefit, they get the cost, and so they should actually be compensated for that contribution, right? So we do need business models, but so the other issue is we need business models that become self-sustaining, not philanthropy. Philanthropy is not going to save us here. There isn't enough money. And the thing is, philanthropy also gets tired. Okay, you've rewilded these guys. Good, let's walk away, let's find our next project. Yeah, and then you leave the rancher saying, but I got to get paid for this, you know? Like, how do I get paid for this? So we actually have to think about developing other streams of finance that can actually support this and support the stewardship effort. So if you're going to give up cattle ranching for doing this, you ought to be compensated for that. And that is economics and business needs to think about that a lot more too. Yeah, yeah. So that's a really good point. Yes?
So the example, I think there were 2 or 3 examples of rewilding initiatives involving mountain lions. Curious how those are received by the local folks.
Fortunately, in the areas where that's happening, there aren't many people living there, right? And actually, in Chile, they're symbolic creatures in their country, so they do revere them. There are places actually in the Himalayas where you have, especially in maybe Mongolian herders or Tibetan herders, that actually get their cattle preyed upon by snow leopards and things like that. But they have a different ethic. They realize that these creatures are part of our nature, and so, okay, we'll accept the loss of a cattle here and there to have this animal live with us on the landscape. I mean, if they became marauders and just wiped out a herd, that would be a different story. But they're willing to accept some loss to have this intact nature, because they also appreciate that intact nature that these wild animals creates the productivity that their herds rely on, right? And that's the other thing is, in the American West, that isn't valued. You know, BLM lands, Forest Service lands where ranchers graze their cattle, you know, again, it's public lands and they're grazing there because they can't sustain it just on their ranches. And yet they don't want wildlife there. But the wildlife are really important in actually creating the productivity that they have their cattle grazing. So you know, we need to think about our relationship with nature, and we can be utilitarian about it, you know, realizing that nature provides these services for us. Let's protect nature so that we can have a long-term sustainability. Yeah. Yep.
I had a question about the spider in the field.
Yes.
Just in terms of the logistics of how you did that, was that a removal experiment, or did
Yeah.
What we do is we have experimental cages. So if anybody wants to see it, drive over to Smith College's field station. We've got cages there where we're doing experiments. They're cylindrical cages made from page wire fencing, and then you put window screen over it. You sink them into the ground, you put a top on, you open it up, and you put, you know, grasshoppers in, or grasshoppers and spiders at various densities. And so you can do the experiment where you have nothing but vegetation, just the grasshoppers and the spiders. Yeah, yeah. And the beauty of these small creatures is you can stock them at their natural field density. So you're not creating artifacts by putting in too many animals and making the case that, oh, these animals are important. Yeah, they're important because you put in too many, right? So these are at their natural field densities too. Something you absolutely could not do with an elk or a bison, right? Yeah.
If we've come to the end, then I will thank our speaker again very much for your presentation and for the great questions. As always, I think if you have a couple lingering questions that you want to ask individually, come do that. And thanks all for joining us this semester, and again to Dr. Oswald Schmitz for presenting.